चेक करो क्या लाइव जा चुका हो कि नहीं.
मैं करता हूँ.
मैं भी कर रहा हूँ फ़ोन से. आए.
आया नहीं.
ये 25 दिसंबर ये वेटिंग फॉर नो वन. हाँ इसमें तो लाइव दिखा रहा है कि मैं आ चुका हूँ लाइव.
व्हाट.
व्हाट. ओ आ गया. जा चुका हूँ मैं. रिलोड करके देख.
हाँ आ गया.
चेक करो क्या लाइव जा चुका हो कि नहीं. ठीक है हो गया.
हो गया.
काम कर ले अब.
हाँ कर रहा हूँ.
करोड़ों लोग देख रहे हैं हमें. मिस्टर बीस से ज़्यादा व्यूअर्स हैं हमारे पास.
If you've ever written a text document before using something like Google Docs or Microsoft Word, you've probably seen something like this. This is a toolbar that allows us to change the style of our text.
इतना कंफ्यूजन हो रहा है. दो आवाज सुन रही थी अभी.
अच्छा तूने वो पार्सक से कर रखा होगा है.
नहीं वो मैंने लाइव चलाया था ना. तो समझ आया कौन सा तू बोल रहा है कौन सा तू नहीं बोल रहा.
We can center it,
Organization of data
etc.
in
आवाज सही आ रही है ना मेरी उसमें.
हाँ अच्छी सही से आ रही.
In CSS, we have a style for each of these things. Let's go to our code, and we're gonna first start by creating some.
गाने डिस्कॉर्ड पे
देख ले चला ले. तेरी मर्जी क्योंकि उसमें बार-बार लगाने पड़ेंगे. दिक्कत
नहीं वो आ रहा है तेरा लोडिंग लुकिंग फॉर अ गेम टू कैप्चर आ रहा है.
What the hell. चल करता हूँ उसको सही करता हूँ.
अबे भाई
मैं दूसरा वो लगा रखा दिखा पता नहीं.
तूने गेम कैप्चर लगा दिया ना. स्क्रीन कैप्चर लगा. विंडो कैप्चर.
विंडो कैप्चर से तो होएगा ना. डिस्प्ले कैप्चर आएगा ना.
नहीं विंडो कैप्चर भी आता है अगर तेरे को सिर्फ एक विंडो करनी है.
मुझे 2-3 विंडो करनी है ना लेकिन.
हाँ तो डिस्प्ले करता है.
हो गया. फास्ट एंड फ्यूरियस. वैसे गाने मत चलाओ उस पे तो क्योंकि मैं YouTube पे देख रहा हूँ ना.
A paragraph.
पैराग्राफ करना है.
And then inside our paragraph, let's start with the text here. So I'm going to copy and paste this into our paragraph, and I'm just going to reorganize the code a little bit and save. Remember that in HTML, these extra spaces and new lines don't matter. Now refresh the page, and we have our first paragraph that we can practice with. Next, let's create a style element so we can write some CSS code. Now we'll set a class on this paragraph so that we can target it in CSS. Class equals video-title, because this is a video title that I copied from YouTube. So let's save it and refresh. And now we can start targeting this paragraph in our CSS. So remember, we're going to start with a dot to target a class, and we're going to target video-title. So the first thing we're going to change is the font. To change the font, the CSS property is font-family. So websites by default use the font called Times New Roman. We're going to change the font to a font called Arial. Save it and refresh, and now you can see we changed the font. Let's go to the next one. So this is the font size, and we can change the font size using the property font-size, and let's change it to something like 30 pixels. Save it and refresh, and now we have a bigger font.
I mean thumbnail नहीं वो
The next
live का जो
example
है.
is let's make it bold.
क्या लगा मतलब.
We're gonna go here
जो तेरा लाइव आ रहा है ना होम पेज पे वो ऐसे वो आ रहा है तेरा चैनल का लोगो.
to be
पता नहीं क्यों आ
bold.
रहा है.
Save it and refresh, and now we have bold font. So as you can see, CSS has properties for doing all of these things, and for most of these properties it's pretty easy to Google them. For example, let's Google for how to make a font italic. So we'll go to Google, and we just need to search something like CSS text italic. Now the first result, we're gonna go here, and if you scroll down, you can see this CSS font style italic. So I'm going to copy this and paste it in my code. Save it and refresh, and now we have italic text. The last one I'm going to show you for now is how to center this text. because in our exercise, we have an exercise where the text is centered. To center text, we're going to go to our code and we're going to type text-align. So this is the property for centering text.
स्टाइल आता है अच्छा नहीं जी ना हाँ
ओ लीरो लीरो
अबे
हो
क्या कर रहा हूँ
जाऊंगी
मैं कुछ नहीं जी
अर्जन वेली ने ओ पैर जोड़ के गंडासी मारी अर्जन वेली ने ओ पैर जोड़ के गंडासी
क्या करना
मारी
चाह रहा हूँ मैं फॉन्ट आएगा इधर
or putting it to the left or to the right. Now we're going to give a value of center. Save it and refresh, and that's how we center our text. So that was pretty easy, right? Now let's go ahead and try to copy this style in our exercise. So if you remember, the general strategy for creating anything that we see is first create the element with HTML and then style it with CSS one by one.
यार हाथ ठंडे
Let's go
पड़
ahead
रहे हैं
and do
लिखा नहीं जा रहा
that for this exercise.
कोई नहीं
Just
गर्म
going
हो
to
जाएगी लिख
resize
के
this back,
What
and
the
we're
heck?
going to start
नहीं हो रही भाई
by
क्या
resetting
करूँ
all
मैं?
of these styles. Save it and refresh. First, I'm going to start with the font family. So for this exercise, I actually use the font
हाँ ना ले लो दे दो
family Arial, just to make it easier for us. So we're going to set the font dash family to Arial. Save it and refresh. Next, I'm going to change the font weight. So this font is bold, and I want to make my font bold as well. So we're going to add font dash weight bold. Save it and refresh. Next, let's change the font size. So I'm going to change this font size to something bigger, like maybe 20 pixels. Save it and refresh. And it looks a little too big compared to the design, so let's tone it down just a little bit, maybe 18 pixels. Save and refresh. Okay, so I think that looks close enough. Next, you'll notice that this text sort of wraps around to a second line, while ours doesn't. The way to make this happen is we're going to set a width on this title. Now I know that in the previous section we said it's bad to set a width, but here it's actually what we want. Because if we set a width, we're going to force the text onto a second line. So let's go ahead and set a width right now, and I'll set it to something like 400 pixels. Let's see how that looks. Refresh. Okay, so it needs to be less than that. Let's do 300 pixels. Save and refresh. Okay, so that looks right to me now. And the final thing with the title is I notice there's more spacing between the lines here than what we have. So to adjust the spacing between lines, the property is called line-height. So don't worry if it seems like we're learning a lot of new properties. The point of this lesson is for us to go through some complicated examples together, which will prepare you for the exercises that you can practice on your own. So for this line height, let's try something like 20 pixels. Save it and refresh. Okay, so it looks like that didn't work. Let's change it to 26 maybe. Save it and refresh. Okay, maybe 24. Save and refresh. Okay, so I think that looks
Good
pretty
night.
close.
Good
Next,
night.
let's work on the second paragraph. So we're going to create a new paragraph. 3.4 M views. And now to create this dot, we're going to create something called an HTML entity. So an HTML entity lets us type out special characters. For example, this dot and this check mark. To get the HTML entity for this dot, I'm going to Google HTML entity this. So an HTML entity, we're going to create a new paragraph, 3.4 m views. And now to create this dot, we're going to create something called an HTML entity. So an HTML entity lets us type out special characters. For example, this dot and this check mark. To get the HTML entity for this dot, we're going to Google HTML entity middle dot. And now if we scroll down, this will give us some HTML code that we can copy into our code. So I'm going to copy this and then paste it here. And that's going to create a dot on our page. So if I save it and refresh, that's what we get. Now I'm going to type out the rest of the text in this paragraph. Now save that and refresh. So now remember, the general process is we created the element with HTML, now we're going to style it one by one. First, let's give this a class so we can target it.
Dance for me.
Let's call this video-stats. And now in our CSS, we're going to style this text. We're going to start with font-family Arial. Save and refresh. And then we're going to change the font size. So it looks like our design is a little bit smaller than what we have. Let's change the font size to maybe 14 pixels. Save and refresh. And I think that looks pretty close. Next, let's change the color. So let's set a color of maybe gray and refresh. Okay, so that's a little too light. So to get an exact color, we can right click in a blank area of the web page, click inspect, and then we're going to inspect the styles of this element. So the trick to doing that is we're going to click this top left icon, hover over this element and click it. And then we can find all its styles in the Computed tab. So if we scroll down, we can get the text styles of the and we can right click in a blank area of the web page, click inspect, and then we're going to inspect the styles of this element. So the trick to doing that is we're going to click this top left icon, hover over this element and click it. And then we can find all its styles in the Computed tab. So if we scroll down, we can get the text color. So let's copy this and save. Let's refresh, and that looks pretty good compared to the design. Next, let's adjust the spacing between these two paragraphs. So remember from the previous lesson, the spacing outside of an element is called the margin.
I'll be
So remember from the previous lesson, the spacing outside of an element is called the margin. But if we look at our code, we didn't actually set any margin yet. So why is there so much space between these two paragraphs? And the reason is, if we right-click in an empty area of the web page and click Inspect, and we click this icon and hover over this paragraph already has margin at the top and bottom. So if we click this, go to Computed, it has 14 pixels of margin at the top and 14 at the bottom. And the same thing for this paragraph. And the reason for this is because paragraphs by default come with margin at the top and at the bottom. So that's why there's all this spacing that we have here where we didn't set it in the CSS. So the general process is we're going to remove the default spacing and then we're going to set our own spacing. So let's go into our code, and first we're going to remove the margin dash bottom of the title, set that to 0, and we're also going to remove the margin at the top of the second paragraph and set it to 0. Save that and refresh, and now there's no default spacing between these and they're really close together. Next we can set a more precise margin bottom. So let's set it to maybe 20 pixels. Let's see how that looks. Save it and refresh. Okay, so that's way too much space. Let's tone it down to something like maybe 5. Save and refresh. Okay, so I think this looks pretty close to the design actually. Let's move on to the next paragraph. We're gonna move all the way down and create a new paragraph element. With this text inside. And now for this check mark, we're also going to use an HTML entity. Now I know that you can actually copy this and put it into our code directly, but some browsers might not support this, so that's why we're using HTML entities. We're going to go to Google, and we're going to search HTML entity check mark. And I'm going to scroll down and grab the HTML entity. copy, paste, save it. Let's go back and refresh. Okay, so that looks pretty good. Next, let's keep styling these one by one. So I'm gonna go a little bit faster here because it's basically the same thing that we've been doing for the first two. Let's call this one video author, and then we'll style it up here. So we'll set the font family to Arial, like the rest of the paragraphs. I'm gonna set the color to the same as this paragraph. So copy and paste. Okay, that looks pretty good. Oh yeah, we have to set the font size. Looks a little too big right now. Set the font size to 14 pixels. Next, we're going to reset the default spacing here. So we're going to set the margin dash bottom and remove it by setting it to 0, and also remove the margin top and set it to 0. Save and refresh. And now we're going to set a more precise margin. So let's try maybe 30 pixels. See how that looks. Okay, that's way too much. Maybe 20 pixels. Okay, I think that looks about right. Then we're going to do the third paragraph. Let's go down here, create the element, and then style it with CSS. Just going to copy and paste this in here. Save and refresh.
नींद आ रही है. कितने पेज कर लिए? What
एक.
the hell? ओ हाँ अच्छा, मैं सोचा था पता नहीं क्या हो गया. एक पेज ही करा अभी तक का.
हाँ.
नाइस. क्या कर रहा था? गाने सुन रहा था, सो रहा था, क्या कर रहा था?
अरे देख, मैं तेरे को वो वीडियो खोल के दिखाता हूँ.
वीडियो खोल के दिखाता है? दिखा भाई. कहाँ
ये
गया?
देख,
रुक जा.
ऐसे पेज बनाने पड़ रहे हैं.
अच्छा, सजा सजा के.
हाँ, अभी मैंने दूसरा पेज शुरू ही किया है.
मैं तो
अभी
भाई
फर्स्ट पेज बनाया मैंने.
मेरी की तो इतनी सुंदर तेरी वीडियो अटक गई.
मेरी वीडियो अटक रही है.
हाँ, तेरी वीडियो अटक गई.
कोई ना, चलो अटकने दे.
हाँ, बंद कर दे वीडियो. तेरा फेस रिवील कर दिया था मैंने.
कोई ना.
लाइव चल तो रहा है ना, चेक कर लो.
क्या?
लाइव चल तो रहा है ना.
हाँ हाँ, चल रहा होगा.
हाँ, तेरी वीडियो, तेरी चेहरा आ रहा है अभी उसमें. किस टाइम सोऊंगा मैं? 9 बजे. सुबह पेपर भी है. अलार्म लगा लो 4 बजे का. 4:05, 4:10, 10, 4:15, 4:20. मैंने कितने 5 अलार्म लगा लिए भाई साहब, क्योंकि सुबह अगर आँख नहीं खुली ना मेरी से दिक्कत हो जाएगी बहुत बड़ी. कुछ नहीं पढ़ा मैंने अभी तक का. हेलो. हाँ, सुन रहा है. ठीक है.
अभी सोने जा रहे है क्या तू?
क्या
अभी सोने जा रहे है क्या?
है? समझ आ रहा है मतलब? हाँ.
अभी सोने जा रहे है क्या?
नहीं, अभी कौन सोएगा इतनी जल्दी.
So that we can target it. Let's call this video dash description. Go up here, video dash description. We want a font family of Arial, a font size of 14 pixels, and the same color. And we save it and refresh. Okay, that looks pretty good. And now we want to give it a width to make it wrap around like this. So let's set the width to the same as the title, which is 300. Width 300 pixels. Save and refresh. Okay, so it looks like this IO is actually on a separate line. Let's make it 280. Save and refresh. Alright, so that looks pretty good. And I'm also going to make it 280 up here. Just to make sure they're the same. So the last thing I'm going to change is the height or the space between these lines. To do that, we're going to use line height. Let's scroll down and then add another property called line-height. And let's set this to 20 pixels. Let's see how that looks. Save and refresh. And let's set it to maybe 22 pixels. Save and refresh. Okay, so I'm pretty happy with this. And lastly, we're going to modify the space between these two paragraphs. First, we're going to reset the default margin. Let's get rid of the margin bottom on the first one here and the margin top on the second one. So margin dash top, I'm going to get rid of it and set it to 0. Save and refresh. And then we're going to set on the set. Looks real youtube.com and the general process that we refresh. Alright, so that looks really good to me. We just recreated a really nice looking style that you can find on youtube.com, and the general process that we use is first we created the elements with HTML and then we styled them with CSS one by one. So before we move on to the next exercise, I'm going to show you a way to clean up our code. So if you notice, all of our styles right now have a line called font family Arial. Now we can actually clean this up and remove the duplication by creating a new style. This time we're going to target all paragraphs on the page, and we're going to give all paragraphs font-family: Arial. Save. So this style is going to apply to all paragraphs, which means all of these. That means that we actually don't need this line in any of these class styles anymore. So we can actually remove all of these. Now if I save it and I refresh, you can see that nothing changes because this is doing the same thing as the code that we had before. So you can also see from this example that an element can be targeted by two sets of styles. For example, for this code here, we're targeting all P elements on the page and all elements with a class of video-title. If we scroll down here, we have a P element that has a class of video-title, which means it's going to be targeted by both this set of styles and this set of styles. So it's being targeted by multiple sets of styles. Now another thing that we can clean up is, remember how we reset the margins for all of our paragraphs? Instead of doing it for each one individually, we can actually put it all up here. So for example, we can set the margin dash top to 0 and the margin dash bottom to 0. We save it and we refresh. It looks pretty much the same, except we're now cleaning up all of the default styles up here so that we don't have to do it in our code at the bottom. So we don't need this anymore, or this, or this. If we save that and refresh, we still get the same thing because we've reset all of our styles in this set of styles. Now the last concept I want to show you before we move on to the next, it looks pretty much the same, except we're now cleaning up all of the default styles up here so that we don't have to do it in our code at the bottom. So we don't need this because we've reset all of our styles in
ये
this
क्या
set
चल
of
रहा
styles.
है ऋषि है क्या चल रहा है ये कुछ नहीं पढ़ाई चल रही है कभी वेलो कभी एनिमेटेड अब कोडिंग जॉनर कैसा चल रहा है
मेरा कभी एनिमेटेड कभी कोडिंग क्या है भाई, मैं जान रहा, बताना पार्थ.
तेरा है ऑलराउंडर
Now the last
I'm
concept
the
I want to
highest
show
in
you
the
before we
room.
move on to the next exercise is the fact that in this set of styles, we're setting the margin bottom to 0. But here, we're also setting the margin bottom to 5 pixels and the margin bottom to 20 pixels. So how does that work? We're setting it to 0 here and to 5 and 20 here. Which style does the element actually get? And the answer is we're getting the style down here. So if we refresh, you'll notice that there's still 20 pixels of space between these two paragraphs. Now you might think that it's because this line is at the top, and then once we get to this line, it overrides anything that comes before it. But if we actually move this to the top, and we save and reload, you'll see that we still have 20 pixels of margin bottom. So why is this happening? This is something called CSS specificity. If we have multiple lines setting the same property, there's actually a priority that the browser follows. So in this situation, this style has more priority than this style. And to determine which one has more priority, we have to look at this word before the brackets. So this word tells us what these styles are targeting. This is known as a selector. This is another selector that targets a particular class. Now the selector that is the most specific is going to have higher priority. So this selector is actually more specific than paragraphs. So what I mean by specific is that this targets all paragraphs on the page, and this targets a specific class. So not all paragraphs are going to have this class of video-stats. So that's why this is more specific.
कल वैल्यू लाइव
It
करेंगे.
targets a smaller group of
अगर
elements
इंटरनेट लैग नहीं
than
कर रहा
this.
तो
That's
पिंग हाई
why
आता है यार.
this line has priority
5G से
over
ट्राई
this
करके
line.
देखूंगा.
So that's just an introduction to CSS specificity. For now, just know that a class name like this has more priority than an element name like this. So I'm going to move this code back. Next, we're going to copy this text from Apple. So you can see that there is a background color and the text is centered. And also if I hover over this part of the text, we get a pointer on our mouse. Mouse, and we have an underlined text. So let's see how we can do this. First, we'll create the element, and then we'll style it one by one. So we'll go down here, and we're going to create a new paragraph, and let's copy this text into that paragraph. And paste. Oops. Save it and refresh. Okay, so that looks good. So usually if you have a greater than or less than symbol, you'll want to create it with an HTML entity, because the browser could confuse these symbols with an HTML tag. So I'm going to search for the HTML entity for greater than. So this is the symbol that we want. I'm just going to copy and paste this into our code. Save it and refresh. Next, let's actually add some space at the bottom of this paragraph so that we can see our new paragraph clearly. So we're going to go here and just add some margin to the bottom. And just add some margin to the bottom.
Velvet song. How to train your dragon. पीयूष, तूने हाउ टू ट्रेन ड्रैगन तो देखी होगी ना?
क्या?
हाउ टू ट्रेन योर ड्रैगन तो देखी होगी ना?
हाँ वो कार्टून सी।
What the hell?
हाँ वो कार्टून सी तो है।
कार्टून थी तो है, लेकिन क्या उसमें क्या है?
ड्रैगन सा एक बच्चा सा ड्रैगन सा। याद नहीं मुझे मूवी और, लेकिन हाँ देखी है मैंने, पूरी नहीं देखी कभी। और वो ड्रैगन सा ही तो है उसमें।
या
तो मुझे मतलब दिमाग में आ रही है, मैं या वैसे
तीन पार्ट है, तीनों पार्ट देखे, मजा देंगे तेरे को देख के।
बढ़िया है क्या?
बहुत बढ़िया है भाई, वन ऑफ द बेस्ट मूवीज है वो।
मैं हिंदी
because it's a little bit too
थोड़ी बहुत
cluttered right
देखी
now.
होगी, याद नहीं अच्छे, मतलब
Alright,
ये
so that
याद है
looks
कैसे
pretty
दिखती है
good.
वो
We're
कार्टून
going to
स्टाइल
start
में,
by
समझ
adding a
गया।
class to our paragraph so we can target it in our CSS.
मतलब अभी भी देखता हूँ उसे,
Class equals
क्या?
maybe
मतलब अभी भी उस मूवी को देखता हूँ कभी कभार।
apple
हैं।
dash text. Save it and refresh. And apple. Okay, and first I'm actually also going to give some spacing at the bottom, so it's easier for us to see our actual code. So 50 pixels at the bottom, save and refresh. And now it's a little easier to see what we're working with. Refresh. And now it's a little easier to see what we're working with. So next, I'm going to change the font size. One thing you'll notice is that the font family is already Arial. If we scroll back up, we have this set of styles that target all paragraph elements, so it's already set our font family to Arial. Let's scroll back down, and let's adjust the font size. So this one looks a little bit smaller, so let's set it to maybe 14 pixels. Let's see how that looks. Save it and refresh. Okay, so I think that looks pretty similar to the design. And now the next step is let's set a background color of red. Now a trick for getting the background color is we're going to right click in an empty area, inspect, click this icon, and click the element we want to copy styles for, and then go to the computer tab and scroll down. Now we have the background color. I'm just going to copy this and paste it in here. So background dash color. I'm going to paste that. Save and refresh. Okay. Next we're going to do the text color. So let's set the text color to white. Color dash white. Save and refresh. And now if we look at our design, this text is actually centered on the page. So remember, the property for centering text is text dash align. And the last thing is there's some spacing at the top and the bottom, and pixels, 10 pixels. So I think it's enough. And when we hover over, practice our Google skills, and we're just going to search for CSS text underline. So keep it simple. And then in the first link, we have the text decoration property. We scroll down, we have an overline, line through, and underline. We scroll down, we have an overline, line through, and underline. So let's grab this piece of code. I'm going to just copy it in here. Save and refresh. Now, unfortunately, this property actually affects the entire paragraph, but we want it to only affect this part of the text. So how do we do that? We're going to need to learn something called a text element. So a text element is an element that is inside a line of text. So let's do an example just to see how it works. We're going to go to the bottom and we're going to create a new paragraph to practice with. And let's actually just copy this text and put it in there. Save and refresh. And now we're going to create some text elements on this paragraph. So the first text element I'm going to show you is called the strong element. So now let's copy maybe this text and then put it in there. And save and refresh. So the strong element here creates this bolded text that you see on the web page. So the thing to know about text elements is that they essentially exist inside a line of text, and then they modify that part of the text. So they're not modifying the whole thing. Another text element we can create is the U element. So this one creates some text that is underlined. So if we move this text into here, save it and refresh, we now get an underlined text element. So that is how we style specific parts of a line of text. The final text element I want to show you is called the span. So let's create a span element. And we're going to put this text inside. So cut and paste. Save it and refresh. Okay, so the span element is here, but you'll notice that nothing changed. And that's because the span element is the most generic text element. It has no styles. So the span is really useful because we can actually give it a class and we can style we now get an underlined text element. So that is how we style specific you is called the span. So let's create a span element. And we're going to put this text inside. So cut and paste. Save it and refresh. Okay, so the span element is here, but you'll notice that nothing changed. And that's because the span element is the most generic text element. It has no styles. So the span is really useful because we can actually give it a class and we can style it ourselves and give it any style we want. Now we could add the class attribute to these other text elements like the strong and the u element, but notice that these text elements come with a default style, and that may not be what we want, especially in this situation where we don't actually want a style until we hover over it. So that's why we use the span text element. It lets us modify a specific part of the text without affecting the whole thing, and it's the most flexible, and we can style it however we want. So if we give it a class of span example, and then go to our CSS, and then we target span example, we can give it any styles that we want. For example, we can set a color of red. Now if we save this and refresh, the span now turns this part of the text red. The other cool thing is that everything we know about CSS still applies. So we can target span example, colon, hover. And these styles will only apply when we hover over the span. So in this case, let's underline it because that's what we want. So if we do text dash decoration and underline, just like up here, save it and refresh. Now this span has a color of red here, and when we hover over it, these style apply and it's going to get underlined. Let's use what we learned here to finish up our example. We're going to first remove this line because we don't want to underline the whole thing. Let's refresh. And we want to create a span so that we only target this part of the text. Let's go back down into here. Bit clear, and we're going to style it now. And the last thing is that we want it to be underlined when we hover over it. So let's create a hover style. Shop-link, and we're going to give this pseudo class colon hover. And we're going to underline it with text decoration, save it and refresh. And now when we hover over this, it's going to turn our mouse into a pointer and it's going to underline it. So we've achieved the exact same styles as our design. So there's one last thing I'm going to show you in this lesson. Let's go back into our code. We're going to scroll all the way to the bottom and recall that in HTML, if we have multiple spaces like this, it will combine them all into one space. So if I save this and refresh, you'll see that only one space shows up here. So I'm going to show you how to get over this problem. Basically, instead of typing out multiple spaces in our HTML, all we have to do is set a margin left on this text element. So we're going to set a margin left on this element, and it's going to add spaces on even the professional looking text like this and like this. We first create the element with HTML and then we style it one by one with CSS. And if we want to style only just a part of the text, we have to use a text element like a span.
कितने कर लिया तूने?
3 पेजेस। 3 पेजेस।
3 पेजेस, ओ माय गॉड। हाँ तो प्रो बंदे बनते जा रहे हो भाई।
4 भी स्टार्ट कर रहा हूँ। बेटा एक काम करते लास्ट आगे 1 मिनट। हेलो।
भाई डरा दिया। 25 pixels font size. Hmm.
Which one has more priority?
पीयूष,
हाँ,
तेरे पास दो ऑप्शंस है।
नहीं चाहिए। बोल चल, क्या ऑप्शन है?
तेरे पे दो ऑप्शन है, बता तेरे को, अगर तेरे को चुनना हो तो कौन सा चुनेगा, ठीक है। फर्स्ट ऑप्शन ये है कि तू बहुत फेमस होए, तू अच्छे खासे पैसे कमाए, लेकिन तू 40 या 50 की उम्र में, 50 की उम्र में तू मर जाए, ठीक है। और लेकिन उसके बाद तेरे को सब याद रखेंगे।
अच्छा।
या फिर तू 90 साल तक जिए,
हाँ।
ठीक ठाक कमाए,
हाँ।
लेकिन मतलब ठीक ठाक नहीं, उससे फर्स्ट वाले ऑप्शन से ज्यादा कमाए,
हाँ।
लेकिन कोई तेरे को याद ना रखे, तो कौन सा चुनेगा?
सेकंड ऑप्शन।
बहुत है।
हाँ, जरूरत क्या है मुझे याद करने की?
हम्म,
अगर कोई
तो
मुझे
ये
इतने
मुझे याद नहीं करना, उन लोगों को तेरे को याद करना है।
पता है, क्या जरूरत है मुझे याद करने की?
बहुत भी सही है।
दुनिया से चले गए तो बस काम खत्म, जरूरत थोड़ी ना किसी को याद करने की। ये मोदी को, क्या मोदी कह रहा था, सॉरी गांधी को याद करते हैं, कुछ फ़ायदा हो रहा है? मुझे लगता नहीं इसकी बात करके कुछ फ़ायदा होता है भाई? सही बोल रहा हूँ गलत बोल रहा हूँ?
हम्म,
बता भाई, तू कौन सा चूज़ करेगा?
मैं फर्स्ट।
मुझे नहीं चाहिए भाई कोई मुझे याद करे। हम ऐसे ही ठीक है, अपनी मम्मी पापा हमसे पहले तो हमसे हमारे मम्मी पापा चले जाएंगे, तो और किसी को याद करने की ज़रूरत क्या है भाई?
हम्म,
फॉन्ट वेट बोल्ड।
पूछो। यार प्लीज हो गए।
हम्म, क्या बात? 4 पेजेस हो गए? हेलो।
1 घंटे में 4 पेज हुए बस। आधे घंटे में 2 पेज और होंगे।
कितने पेज करने थे टोटल?
मेरे को कम से कम 20 करने थे, मतलब 10 ऑलरेडी हो रखे थे, 10 और
हाँ
करने थे।
हाँ।
4 हो गए।
अच्छा,
टोटल 20 करने थे, अभी तक 14 हो गए मेरे।
6 और बचे हैं। क्या लगता है करके सोएगा या फिर कल स्कूल में करेगा थोड़े बहुत?
स्कूल में कर ही नहीं पाऊंगा, साथ चैट जीपीटी में है।
तो फ़ोन ले जाना क्या हो गया?
अभी मैं 3 पेज 4 पेज और लिख सकता हूँ मैं।
हम्म,
एक इंडेक्स हो जाएगा।
तो 1-2 पेज ऊपर नीचे भी तो चलेंगे, कौन सा गिनते हैं कॉलेज वाले स्कूल वाले?
गिनते हैं, पेजेस गिनते हैं।
गिनेंगे तेरे पेज?
वर्ड्स नहीं गिनते, पेज गिनते हैं।
वर्ड्स कौन ही गिनेगा, इतना किस पे टाइम है? मार्जिन टॉप 0 पिक्सल। मार्जिन बॉटम 0 पिक्सल। 10।
Improve it slowly. Between the time on my feet, you're on my seat, and on my house, you're on my wrist. Look at my eyes, tell me things.
V2 में चले आए कल?
V2 चल रही है।
मुझे
स्कूल जाऊंगा लेकिन मैं।
तो बात 1:30 तक का तो मैं ही आऊँगा कॉलेज से पेपर देके।
तो जा रहे क्या? अच्छा हाँ।
कल लास्ट पेपर है ना।
हम्म।
देखता हूँ, पक्का नहीं पता मेरे जाने का।
Sun, the love, the paper, the spell.
और सुनाओ भैया।
वैसे पीयूष,
हाँ।
जब हम दिल्ली गए थे मजा आया था यार, सब कुछ खुद से करने में।
कॉमिक कॉन में है, मतलब मजा आया था, इतना नहीं आया था, लेकिन बाकी सब
हाँ
चीजें
दिमाग
वगैरह
खराब हो गया था
घूमने
पता
में
है।
बाकी चीजें घूमने में मजा आया था।
हाँ,
हम्म।
कॉमिक कॉन का दोनों चीज हुई थी हमारे साथ, मजा भी आया था
कॉमिक कॉन में
दिमाग
मतलब
भी
यार
खराब।
ठीक है, मतलब ऐसे सही बताऊँ, इतना मतलब बातें करने के लिए कोई ज़्यादा साथ में थे ही नहीं, इसलिए नहीं मज़ा नहीं आया ज़्यादा।
शायद हाँ
मस्ती वस्ती
इसीलिए।
करने के लिए, इसलिए तो कह रहा हूँ मैं। और वहाँ पे
हम्म,
कोई मिल भी नहीं रहा था, सब तो ऐसे ही अंग्रेजी झाड़ रहे थे अपनी अपनी।
वही।
अगर यहाँ पर होता ना, यहाँ पे भाई आधे बंदे तो अपनी वो बोल रहे होते, उनके साथ मुझे करते।
उनके साथ मजा आता था भाई।
वही तो। प्लस वहाँ पे भीड़ ज़्यादा थी हम लोगों के लिए।
हम्म।
हमें भीड़ पसंद नहीं इतनी।
हाँ, मेरे को तो बिल्कुल पसंद नहीं भाई भीड़।
मुझे कौन सा पसंद है भाई। एप्पल पैरा और कुछ तो नहीं डालना इसमें.
दिमाग खराब हो गया, वही सेम सेम गाने सुनते 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 सुनते
हैं.
सिर दर्द हो गया मेरा. तो नए गाने सुनने हैं भाई अब मेरे को.
क्लास greater than. दो सौ नौ लाइन बन चुकी है इसकी.
209.
हाँ कोड की.
नाइस.
भाई इसे करने में टाइम लगेगा बहुत. 6 घंटे की वीडियो है, मैं अभी तक 2 घंटे भी कंप्लीट नहीं करी है
नाइस।
CSS की. और एंड में पूरा ये यूट्यूब का वो बनवाएगा मुझसे, क्या बोलते हैं, मतलब सिखा देगा. मतलब कोई भी
बहुत
यूट्यूब का
बढ़िया।
पेज टाइप कुछ बना दिया, फिर किसी भी वेबसाइट का बना दिया पेज.
हम्म,
टाइम क्या हो गया
ना
भाई?
ना माना
10 बज गए.
मुझे कहा है सेन्योरिटा, मगर फिर भी ना जाने क्यों मुझे सन के अच्छा लगा है सेन्योरिटा, नोवेलिएरा मीरा ना।
सेनोरिटा सुन रहे हो?
यार मीरा मीरा दा मेरे से कारे मी, मुझको बाहों में तुम घेरो, समझी ना सेन्योरिटा, चाहत के दो पल भी मिल पाए, कर्म है क्या हमको दो आओ हो जाए, और है क्या सेन्योरिटा, सुनो सुनो सेन्योरिटा, करते हैं हम क्या। सेन्योरिटा ना मैं तुमको निगाहों से, सेन्योरिटा मोहब्बत की एक जुबा है सेन्योरिटा, नो नजर ना फेरो, आओ पास तुम मेरे, मुझको बाहों में तुम घेरो, समझी ना सेन्योरिटा, चाहत के दो पल भी खो जाए, मुझे क्या तो आओ हो जाए, कहते हैं हम क्या। जो भी पल बीता ये सेन्योरिटा, इतनी सी बात है, मुझसे कादेमी को मैं तुमसे कितने पे जाऊंगा, एक पे दो तीन चार पाँच छः सात आठ नौ दस 11 12 13 14 15 16 17 18 18 पे जाऊंगा। एक बार देखना पड़ेगा वो पंचर का, 1 मिनट रुक मैं भी आया।
हम्म.
कुछ भी
हम्म।
आपको एक चीज दिखाऊं?
दिखाओ भैया।
रुकिए 1 मिनट।
बड़ा कैसे होता है? हो गया। 1 सेकेंड। देख क्यों नहीं रही मुझे वीडियो? रुक जा, वीडियो नहीं चल रही। तेरी वीडियो नहीं चल रही, बंद फिर से खोलना।
हेलो।
हाँ,
हाँ
तेरी वीडियो
वो
नहीं
बहुत
चल
बड़ी
रही।
लग रही है। मैं
तेरी आवाज़ वो तेरी वीडियो नहीं चल रही, बंद करके खोलना एक बार। एक सेकेंड। हाँ, चल गया।
ठीक है।
क्या दिखा रहा था? फिर अटक गई तेरी वीडियो।
चल छोड़ भाई छोड़।
दिखाना क्या चाह रहा है, बता ही दे।
अरे वो पंच पंच करना था मेरे को। पंच नहीं मतलब पंचिंग मशीन से पंच करके दिखाना था तेरे को।
पंचिंग मशीन से?
पंचिंग मशीन
In this
वो
lesson, we're gonna learn,
पेपर में छेद करने वाली मशीन।
ओह, अच्छा
and I'll
छेद कर
leave
रहा है क्या उस पे?
हाँ
changing the S box. Let's go to the next view. And access tool. In this lesson, we're going to learn the
बटन बनाना है अब बाय का। बटन को अलाइन कैसे करती है?
ओ इसका सब वो आया Q&A अजय पांडे का 5
हाँ
मिनट
देख
पहले,
लिया मैंने, मतलब वीडियो नहीं देखी लेकिन वो देख लिया मैंने।
5 मिनट अगो।
हाइट पोजीशन
एक मिनट। Okay, file complete over there, Jerry. So we have the name, index, introduction, acknowledgement, certificate, understanding utility, types of utility, IC compilations, role of IC, organization of data, service data, application of utility in IC, challenges, limitations, strategies to overcome, summary हो गया है कुछ पास के ऊपर मारो मैं फाइल को उसमें एक मिनट में हेलो,
बोलो सर।
सो जा।
सो जाओ, टाइम हो गया। हाँ हो तो गई, 10:30 होने वाले हैं।
और उठना भी है।
ये वाला कर लो फिर करता हूँ, सोता हूँ। और क्या करना है इसमें? P- 05।
बन गई फाइल अच्छी खासी।
हम्म।
फाइल अच्छी खासी बन गई।
तेरी है? अच्छी बात है भाई। लेकिन भाई पार जब वो क्या होता है, इतनी मोटी मोटी फाइल हमने जमा करी थी ना, मतलब अच्छा सा लग रहा था कि ये सारा हमने ही लिखा है अपने हाथों से। अलग सी फीलिंग आती है इतने सारा करके।
देख देख जल्दी देख, बन गई वीडियो नहीं तो।
रुक जा, ये रहा, दिखा।
फर्स्ट पोजीशन
बंद
कुछ
हो
नहीं है।
गई, बंद हो गई। तो कैमरे
ओके
में
ना,
कुछ दिक्कत आ रही है?
मैं भी तेरे नेट में दिक्कत आ रही है, अभी लाइव स्ट्रीम कर रहा है ना।
हाँ सही कर रहे हैं, तो बंद ही
चल
कर
बाय।
दे।
बाय बाय।
जा, तू जा रहा है?
हाँ
हो गया था काम?
हाँ
कंप्लीट हो गया?
हाँ।
क्या भाई?
बाय।
वो तो देख ले मैं क्या कर रहा हूँ।
अरे यार सोना है।
तो सो जा, मना कर रहा हूँ मैं।
चलो फिर। कुछ नहीं कर रहा तू।
हम्म।
तू कुछ नहीं कर रहा।
मैं टाइपिंग कर रहा हूँ।
हाँ भाई। बाय
चल
बाय।
बाय, सो जा, गुड नाइट।
गुड नाइट।